Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm going to, if you're able to hear me, that's perfect. Today I'm just going to be answering questions that you guys have. So if you have a question, you can freely raise up your hand and ask. I'm sure you had time to engage with the learning material for all the chapters. So if you have any question that you have, you can ask. Otherwise, I will have to go through chapter 3. That is, if there are no people with questions. And I hope once I go through chapter 3 with you, the remaining chapters are basically a build up on chapter 3, because chapter 3 is basically looking on the research process, marketing research process. And your chapter 4 is looking at the problem definition and objectives, which is one of the steps in the marketing research process. Research design, that will be your chapter 5. It's also part of those steps. Collection of secondary data, chapter 6. Collection of primary data, chapter 7. They are also part of that marketing research process. The same with your chapter 8, quantitative data, management or collection of quantitative data. Chapter 9, measurements and questionnaire design. All those are basically a build up on chapter 3. Issues to do with sampling, which is chapter 10. Data collection, actual data collection, which is chapter 11. Preparation of and processing of data, your chapter 12. Even the chapter 13, where you are looking at data analysis and hypothesis testing. Then the other chapter is basically also on data analysis, which is whereby you analyze the relationships and also the use of statistical techniques. It's also a build up on chapter 3. Writing the research report and the research proposal, it's also, that will obviously be the ultimate result of the marketing research process, whereby you either come up with a research proposal or you come up with the final research report, because the research proposal will still need to cover all those steps which you basically discuss also even in your research report. So this chapter is one of those key chapters whereby once you master it, once you understand everything in it, you will be able to go through all the other chapters on your own, and also by using the material that was provided for you. So at this moment, I will ask if there are people with questions so that we know the way forward. Are there people with questions that they need answered? You can just show by raising up your hand or by typing your question in the chat box. If it's difficult to type your question in the chat box or to raise up your hand, you can safely unmute and proceed to ask your question. Okay, if there are no questions, or whilst you are still thinking of the questions, in the interest of time, I will move on to go through chapter 3 with you so that you can then be able to study the other chapters as you move on. So in this chapter, it is important for you to realize that there's a difference between preliminary research and formal research. Preliminary research is undertaken to establish whether there is need for research. Like you have not yet actually conducted research, or you are not yet actually conducting research, but you're trying to establish on whether there is need to conduct research. And what type of research is required? That is, if you want to conduct research, what type of research is required, as well as to ascertain the feasibility and value of conducting a formal research. So this is whereby you just try to see or to ascertain on whether it is really feasible, whether it is really reasonable to conduct research, or you can actually do with the information that is available for you, or that is available at the disposal of the managers or the researchers in the firm. And before we proceed also to discuss the marketing research process, which is the basic purpose of this particular chapter, it is important to remember the differences between data and information, which we already discussed earlier. In simple terms, data, this is unprocessed information, which is raw, which cannot be used for decision making. But when it comes to information, it is organized. This is data that has been processed, organized, that is now useful or that is now usable for decision making. Marketing research is used to collect information or to collect and process data, which is then presented in a usable and relevant way for the purpose of making decisions in any organization. Key characteristics of formal research is that it is scientific and also is the manner in which it is actually done. So when it comes to formal research, data ought to be collected in a systematic way. It also ought to be analyzed in a systematic way or in a scientific way, so that those results, when they are interpreted, they can actually be used for decision making. So there is science here, there is also need to be organized. So whatever that you will be doing in choosing the process, in choosing the method, in choosing the design, you ought to be able to justify it. And it ought to be scientifically sound. There ought to be reasons why you are adopting such a particular method, such a particular paradigm, such a particular design. If you are to use an instrument to collect data, you also ought to have reasons why you are actually going for that particular instrument. The marketing research process is an orderly and systematic procedure that provides reliable information for decision making. It is actually done in a logical and it is the logical sequence of steps that are followed to collect the data which is required for decision making. So for purposes of this course, which is BC 321 and BC 324, there is need for you to know this basic, very basic 11-step process of the marketing research process. So this process is 11 steps. We ought to know this particular process, this particular 11-step process. And the very first step in this process is whereby you define the problem. I'm sure the next slides will be focusing more on these steps. So for now, I can just highlight them as we will look at them in detail. Where possible, I may also need to just give a hint as to what exactly we will be looking at when we look at that particular step. So for the very first step, whereby you ought to define the problem, we are saying after investigating the actual situation that is on the ground, in demarcating the marketing problem or opportunity. The problem is formulated as a clearly defined research problem or opportunity. So there is need to formulate a research problem or opportunity. So in this case, we are saying after you have determined that there is a problem, you have clearly demarcated it, you know what you want to investigate, you ought to reformulate the problem and clearly define it as a problem or as an opportunity. As we said, research can be opportunity driven, it can also be problem driven. So there is need to define the problem. In other words, the problem is what triggers the need for research. So as an example, maybe in an organization, one manager or managers can realize that there have been a sudden decrease in terms of sales. There has been a sudden decrease in terms of sales. So that may have been identified as a problem. But now, in formulating the research problem, it ought to be clearly defined. So now, if you are to bring it to researchers or to marketing researchers, you can tell them that, okay, in our organization, we have realized that there's been a sudden drop of sales. People are no longer buying our products. But now marketing researchers will need to redefine that particular problem so that it becomes sort of researchable, so that it becomes a research problem. So some may actually say, just bring it clearly to say, okay, there's a sudden drop in sales volume. So they may want now to know what are the challenges or what are the causes of that sudden drop. So in this case, the problem now will become that sudden drop and also the causes or the challenges that are leading to that. Some may also start to think that, okay, this sudden drop may have been as a result of changes in terms of consumer income, in terms of consumer perceptions, in terms of whatever reason that you can think of or that you can find in literature. So as a research problem, you will need to reformulate all those reasons, all those possible solutions to form a possible research problem that can be researched. I know some may find it difficult, but to help you on this, I will need to also provide some examples where research problems were actually formulated. Because many times we will ask you to actually identify a research problem from cases that we will give you, or we will give you a case and ask you to formulate a research problem. So if it's a research problem, obviously there should be a problem in it. What are you trying to solve by research? That's the research problem. So that will be the first step. Then the second step will be to identify the research objectives, the purposes of research. Basically, by identifying the research objectives, what we are basically saying here is that now you need to answer the question, this particular question, which I will phrase in this manner. What is the purpose of the marketing research investigation? What is the purpose of this research? What exactly do you intend achieving? Or at the end of this study, at the end of this research, what is it that you want to have ascertained? What are you researching? What are you trying to investigate? So it is impossible to formulate specific objectives without understanding the problem or the opportunity that you are trying to investigate. So before you formulate your research objectives, you need to also have a clear understanding of the research problem at hand. You need to really understand the problem at hand. Marketing research objectives indicate broadly what the marketing research hopes to achieve. So in broader terms, it just highlights what is it that you want to achieve as a marketing researcher or as a researcher. So objectives need to be phrased in a proper way. It can either be to investigate, it can be to identify, it can be to discover, to explore, it can be to describe or to explain. So you ought to clearly formulate your objectives. Even the wording should point out to what exactly are you trying to do, what exactly are you trying to achieve with that particular research. Are there any questions concerning what we have discussed so far? I hope your assignment is linked or related to what we are discussing, whereby you ought to identify the problem, you also ought to formulate the objectives. So when it comes to formulating objectives, remember the wording is also important. It's also important. They ought to clearly highlight to us what is it that you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to explore? Are you trying to investigate? Are you trying to determine? Are you trying to the words should point to that so that it becomes clear as to what exactly are you trying to do. I'm waiting to see if there is anyone with a question. Otherwise, we will move on. Okay, so if there are no questions, step 3 of this 11-step process involves determining the research design. Determining the research design. So if you read different textbooks, you may be confused when they explain issues to do with research design, research methodology, research methods, research paradigm, and so forth. But it is important at this stage to highlight that you guys ought to stick to the prescribed textbook on this issue. Your prescribed textbook will give research designs or 3 types of research designs. I think it's important for me to highlight that there is what is known as exploratory research design. Then you also have what is known as descriptive research design and causal design. So these 3, they are different as the terms actually express the differences. With exploratory design, what happens here is the researcher will just trying to explore. So in most cases, exploratory design goes hand in hand with qualitative research, whereby you either try to explore the perceptions of people or the experiences of people, the views of people, and exploratory research, in some cases, it can later lead to quantitative research. Then descriptive research, that's where you actually describe. It allows the researchers to describe the problem. And in this case, it can either be qualitative research or quantitative research. Then the last one is causal design. With causal design, mainly it's quantitative research. And this is whereby you try to ascertain the cause and effect, whereby you try to ascertain the relationships, correlation. So causal design is mostly used in quantitative research. So just to emphasize, we have 3 research designs: exploratory research design, descriptive design, and also causal design. Then we have research approaches. In terms of research approaches, we have the qualitative research approach, which deals mainly with people's views, which allows people to express themselves. In most cases, it is narrative. It doesn't deal with any statistical tests. So maybe you use thematic analysis, narrative analysis, and so forth. Data may have been collected through interviews where people can freely express themselves. The extreme opposite of qualitative research approach is the quantitative research approach, which basically deals with statistical methods, in most cases trying to test hypotheses. And there is one which is in between the qualitative research approach and quantitative research approach. Some refer to it as mixed research approach. Some refer to it as triangulation, which allows for the use of both qualitative and quantitative research approach. So I think I have pointed out those the confusion that we normally find in terms of research design, research approach. I think the other one that we also ought to be clear with in terms of, for purposes of this course, is research paradigm, which is the basic philosophy that guides research, including what we think research should be done, what should be called knowledge, who should tell us that knowledge is knowledge. So in terms of research paradigms, we also have two which are on either extremes. One being the interpretivism and the other one being positivism. So with interpretivism, that one goes hand in hand with qualitative research approach, whereby the basic assumption is that people should freely express themselves, people should freely give their views, because information is not really static, but it is co-created by both the researcher and the respondents. Then it doesn't subscribe to the issue of having hypotheses and so forth. Then the other extreme would then be positivism, which states that which is rigid, obviously, and ascribes researchers to the principle of objectivity, to say for us to have information that is usable in terms of research, it should have been collected in an objective manner following certain methods. And in most cases, positivism goes hand in hand with quantitative research approach. I hope that one is clear and we will not have that confusion. Research paradigm, research approach, and research design. Those three, you need to be clear on them. So coming back to explaining the research design, which is a step as per this process, research design basically implies research planning. How are you planning to conduct the research? So it provides an outline, or what can be referred to as the blueprint for the research, and it is also known as the framework that directs research efforts, what the researcher actually follows in the research process. The researcher then draws up a timeline and cost estimate for the marketing research, showing its desirability as well as feasibility related to its potential value. They must also, as a researcher, should also determine the type of data that is needed. I'm sure that should now be clear on whether it is exploratory or it is data to describe a certain scenario, or you want to determine the cause and effect. You should also decide on where you are going to find the data. So the issues to do with population, where you are going to collect your data, sampling, where you are, how you are actually going to reduce that population into a sample, the data collection methods that are going to be used. Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? And if it's data collection method, I'm sure there are three basic or three common data collection methods. One being survey, which is commonly used in marketing research. And most of the cases that you guys will deal with, they will be survey cases. For data collection methods, besides surveys, we also have observations. So with observations, it will clearly be stated that this was an observation, and the third one is an experiment. So those are three data collection methods, and in marketing research, the most common one is survey, and that's the one that you will commonly deal with for purposes of this course. However, there are still people who will fail it when they are asked for the data collection method. After being given a case, some will still say, no, it's an experiment. Although they are told that data was collected from a certain sample, they will still say it was an experiment. But I'm stating it clearly today that most of the cases that you guys will deal with, they will be survey cases, because that is the most common method that is used for marketing research. Then the types of research designs, I have already stated them. We have exploratory research design, descriptive research design, as well as causal design. Okay, so the fourth step will then become the collection of secondary data. Collection of secondary data. Secondary data is basically historical data that has already been collected either by the enterprise or by other outsiders. It will have been collected for another purpose, which is not necessarily the problem at hand. So that is one of the downfalls or one of the shortcomings of secondary data. This is data that is already available, that is readily available, that can be used by the organization. Secondary data can be obtained from both internal sources or from external sources. As we said earlier, that it is already available either within the enterprise or from outside. If the problem or opportunity remains unsolved after using secondary data, then there will be need for a formal marketing research process to be followed, provided it is economically viable and it is practically feasible. So before you then proceed to the process of primary data collection, there is need to ensure that it is economically viable. You also have the means to do it, and it is actually practically feasible. It is possible to conduct research in the manner in which you want to do it. Secondary research, or the collection of secondary data, you can collect these from available sources. It can be records, textbooks, journals, other documents that may be available in the organization or outside of the organization that relate to the problem at hand or to the research problem at hand. It is also important at this stage to highlight that there are shortcomings of secondary data besides the fact that it will have been collected for the problem or for another problem which is not necessarily the problem at hand. I'm sure you agree with me that if you are using any information that was collected to solve another problem, at some other time, that information may be outdated. So it ought to be used with maximum care and with caution. You should also realize that there are aspects that are looked at when evaluating secondary data. So before you use it, you should also take time to realize how was that data actually collected. Was it collected in an ethical manner? Was it collected properly? Because you can use it when it was collected in a way that is not proper. So once the problem cannot be solved using secondary data, you proceed then to select the method of primary data collection. So if you choose to select a survey, as I have said earlier, that in this case, or for purposes of this course, BEC 324 and BEC 321, we will mainly focus on surveys. We will not give too much attention to observations and to interviews. We will focus more on surveys because this is the most commonly used method. So in terms of survey now, in terms of survey, the survey method, this process allows you to collect data from a larger group. You can actually collect data from a larger group. And this is one of the steps in which you now collect primary data. In primary data, this is the data that has not yet been collected or that has not been collected previously and which must be filtered by original research. This is the information that you are going to find through your own research. So if you adopt a survey or if you are using a survey, now you are actually trying to find information or to collect data on your own. That's what we refer to as primary data collection. Primary data can be obtained from internal sources whereby you seek information or you collect information from staff of the enterprise or of your own business or of the business. You can also collect data from other external sources whereby you actually collect data from your customers, from your suppliers, retailers, wholesalers, and any other stakeholder that may be outside of your organization. Primary data can be collected by observation, experimentation, or by surveys. It can also be collected through focus groups, in-depth interviews, and so forth. However, interviews can also be done under survey research, but focus groups, those can actually stand on their own. So if the method that was used was focus groups, in any case that you will see clearly stated. But just to emphasize, most of the cases that you will deal with, they will have used survey method. Each primary data collection method uses different techniques. If it's a survey, maybe you can do it telephonically, it can be done online, it can be a mail survey. In the olden days, they would do them through fax. Some still use fax. They can also be done through personal interviews if they are surveys. So whichever method that is selected, it should be influenced by the objectives of the researcher and the type of research that is to be undertaken, and also the availability of resources and time. So if you are to conduct an exploratory research, obviously the method that you will use should be in line with exploratory research. You cannot then say you will use a questionnaire with fully developed scales and so forth. That would be irrelevant. But if it's causal research, definitely we will need to see a questionnaire with scales that measure the variables that you want to measure. Important to state on the method of primary data collection is to actually to bring it to your attention that whichever method that you select, it has its own advantages and disadvantages. And at this stage, it is those advantages and disadvantages that you can then use to assess the relevance and also the applicability of that particular data collection method or data collection technique that you will adopt. Then the next step after you choose to go for primary data collection will be to design your questionnaire. A questionnaire, in this case, this is the data collection instrument. The data collection instrument. So for each of the data collection methods, be it observation, experimentation, survey, focus groups, and so forth, an instrument should be designed to collect the primary data. You should have an instrument to collect the primary data. Two most important research instruments that can be used are basically the questionnaire, and if it's experimentation, you can then have your electronic equipment or your mechanical equipment. But the questionnaire is important for marketing research, data collection. When designing the questionnaire, there are two types of questions. Okay, or let me say when designing the questionnaire, the type of questions, their form, the wording, sequence, those should be considered carefully. Because if you do not consider your wording carefully, how you word your questions, if you don't consider that carefully, that can also discourage your respondents from completing your questionnaires. You would think that they don't have time, when in actual fact your questionnaire was worded in an inappropriate manner, in a manner which offends the people which should provide you with the information. So the wording of the questionnaire is very important. Also, the type of questions that you ask. Should you ask multiple choice questions? Should you ask those tick box questions whereby they just choose from the options that are already given? Should you ask open-ended questions whereby they freely express themselves on the questionnaire? Again, the type of questions is influenced by the objectives and design of the research. So if your research is exploratory, definitely you don't have even the options or the alternative answers to give to the respondents or to your participants. So you should give them open-ended questions so that they freely express themselves and you will then later get an idea. But if it's something that is already known, whereby literature already gives you a bit of clues, you can give them options. You can ask closed-ended questions whereby they just choose from the alternative answers or from the answer options that you will already have given to them. It is important to carefully consider your questionnaire design or how you design your questionnaire. And questionnaire design, I think for purposes of this course, it's part of chapter 9, which you guys will cover. You will listen to the recordings that are available for you, and you will be able to cover it thoroughly in that particular chapter, where advice will be given on the type of questions, the wording, the sequence of questions, and so forth. So for purposes of this course, or for purposes of these courses, BC 324 and BC 321, we will mainly focus on the questionnaire, as it is the most commonly used measuring instrument that is used for data collection or that is used in marketing research. So for data collection method, we will mainly use survey. For the data collection instrument, we will mainly focus on the questionnaire. Remember, here we are saying we will focus on the questionnaire, but if you are using interviews, you will still need that list of questions, which you call a questionnaire, but now some refer to it as an interview schedule, whereby you have a list of questions, but you may choose to ask them as the respondent gives you answers. Sometimes people, when you ask them one question, they give you answers for 3 questions. So you may later choose to skip the other two and go on to the question that may not have been answered. So all the same, whether you're using the interview schedule or the actual questionnaire, that will be the list of questions. But for purposes of this course, we will mainly focus on the questionnaire. After you design your questionnaire, you should also design the sample plan. The sample plan. So for the sample plan, you need to know your population. You also need to know your sample. So the researcher identifies the respondents or the individuals participating in the research. If the survey population is too large, that is, if the total number of people, elements from which you want to collect data from, if that number is too large for a comprehensive survey or a scientific research, then that warrants for a sample. You need to then come up with a way of choosing a representative sample from that population. And many times it is impossible anyway to actually collect data from everyone in the population or in the target population, which would then be called a census. It is expensive, time consuming, and economical. So many times it is advisable to actually go for a sample, whereby you choose a way in which you choose your sample. But if you are to choose a sample, that sample should be representative of the population. The basic aspects that should be covered in this step is for the researcher to be able to define the population and also to explain the sampling method and the sampling technique, which will then be covered in the chapters that follow. But in terms of your sampling methods, there are basically two methods, which is your probability sampling method and your non-probability sampling methods. With probability sampling method, there is an element to try and eliminate bias. So the researcher's judgment is eliminated in a move to eliminate bias, and there is sort of randomization in terms of choosing the participants. It is important for you in your own time when you are studying, and also when you listen to the pre-recorded content, to listen also to the, or to study the different techniques that are used in random sampling or in probability sampling. That goes without saying also that you ought to study and listen to the recordings also on non-probability sampling techniques. There are also different techniques, and those, in those techniques, you ought to know the differences between those techniques and which technique is relevant at what or in what situation. So you may have under your non-probability sampling, which is subjective, whereby the researcher can use their own judgment in selecting respondents which they think are most suitable for that particular study. You may have, for example, as techniques, your convenience sampling, purposive sampling, but now you need to know which one applies in this particular situation. Another example also of non-probability sampling is snowball sampling. So you also need to know when is it most applicable. What are its advantages? What are the disadvantages? In what situations should it be used? So the same will also go with random sampling or with probability sampling. You have your simple random sampling, systematic sampling, cluster sampling, and so forth. You need to know at what, in what situation should you use each of those techniques, and how does those techniques actually work. So Prof. Elliot has done recordings already through the material that you were already given, which is still available on Blackboard. It is important that you listen also to those recordings. Then the other step, the step that then follows is whereby you actually conduct the investigation. This one we skipped it in terms of your chapters, because there's no need to say when you have finally decided on what you want to achieve, you've come up with the data collection method, you now have the instrument, you now have the population and the sample. There's now need to go to the field and collect data. In terms of the chapters, this is not part of the chapters that you are expected to cover, but it's important to know that in the field, researchers are still expected to behave ethically, to react ethically, and to collect data after they have been trained. You don't just look for field workers, then you send them to the field as if they already know what is expected of them. There is need for training. So the investigation of fieldwork entails the actual collection of primary data from the sample elements. The research is often this is most often the most expensive aspect of research, because this is the actual research now, whereby people go to the field to collect the information. There is also a considerable chance of mistakes being made, but for researchers, it is important to highlight and emphasize that at this stage, there is need to actually eliminate and minimize those mistakes. So part of it is actually to train your investigators, to train your field workers. So there's need to train them, there's need also to supervise them during data collection. The research must be planned thoroughly, and clear instructions and appropriate methods of motivating or of collecting data should actually be presented to those that will go to the field to collect data. You don't just let them do as they please, let them do it as they see fit. If you have already adopted a method, an instrument, and you have already targeted the population and you are using a certain method to select the sample, the field workers should still follow what you have already planned according to your design of the research. Are there any questions concerning what you have covered so far? I think you should ask questions so that I will also find time to keep quiet. Mind you, this is third year. You need to say something. Otherwise, you will graduate before you say anything in class. Are there still people? If you are still in the session, please raise up your hand. I know I can be in a session alone whilst you guys are busy playing football. It's after 3 now. Okay, it's encouraging. I can see people are still there. Okay, so after you conduct the investigation, you also, okay, I'm fine now. I know there are people in the session. You can put down your hands unless you have something else to say. Those with their hands up, you can put them down unless you have something to say. If you have something to say, you can unmute and go ahead to ask your question and say what you want to say. Walter, your hand is up. Do you want to say something?
Okay, see, I would like to ask regarding the methods of research we have. There are some of the sources that I've read before telling me a variety of types of the research. So I'm confusing if what I've read and understand is correct. So let me pose the question to you, like, what are the types of the research methods that we can use to gather the information from the marketing environment? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that question. So you're asking for the types of research methods.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's where the question normally arise, or the confusion normally arise in terms of this particular module. Because there we have what is known as the paradigms, we have designs, then we also have approaches. So when they speak of methods, in most cases, they are looking at all those three, which is the research philosophy, the research design, and the research approach. So some authors combine all those three aspects into one, and they summarize to just say there are two basic research methods, which can be qualitative and quantitative. Others go on to say there are three research methods: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed research. So I'm not sure which ones you found as methods from the sources that you read.
Yeah, are those methods, the qualitative, quantitative, and the mixed, are the ones that I found. Okay, thank you.
So that basically means the authors that you read, they combined those three aspects, which is what is common anyway. But for purposes of this course, it is important for you, in knowing that we have those three research methods: quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. It's also important for you to know the designs, the research designs, where we said you have your causal research design, you have your descriptive, and you have exploratory. It's also important for you to know the paradigms or the research philosophies, which then guides those designs and the approaches. So all those three, they fit into those research methods that you read about.
Okay, so thank you. I would like to also ask concerning the research objective, as you mentioned earlier, that we have got the research objective. That is the main purpose of investigating the research. But I've got the issue, like there are two types of the research objective that we have. How do we exactly distinguish these two types of research objective? Like we have got the primary objective and the secondary objective. As I read, it seems like it sounds similar, like, so may you please, can you further explain to us so that I can understand the difference between the primary and the secondary?
Oh, okay, thank you for that question also. When it comes to primary objectives and secondary objectives, normally if you are conducting research, you will have one primary objective, which is in line with your topic, or which is in line with the aim or purpose of the research. Then that particular secondary, that particular primary objective should then be broken down into secondary objectives. So you cannot have a primary objective and random secondary objectives. The secondary objectives should actually come out of the primary objective. So using the example that I had given earlier, whereby a certain firm realizes that there is a sudden drop in terms of its sales, the primary objective of their research maybe will be to investigate the causes of a sudden drop in sales of its organization ABC. That will be the primary objective, to investigate the causes of a sudden drop in sales, or the causes of a drop in sales of organization ABC. because that is the primary objective. They've seen a sudden drop in sales. But now when it comes to secondary objectives, these should actually be taken out of the primary objective. So here the researcher now, in formulating the secondary objectives, we will need to go to consult literature, to consult management and other sources to find possible reasons, possible causes for that problem, which is a sudden drop in sales. So that may be changes in consumer tastes, changes in consumer income, just as examples, changes in consumer perceptions, availability of substitutes, maybe, just to make it more simple. So now in formulating secondary objectives, you can now have those four coming in now as secondary objectives to say secondary objective A, to investigate the extent to which consumer perceptions are leading or are a cause to a sudden drop of sales. B, you give another cause or another possible cause also that you'll be investigating. But what I'm trying to point out to is that all those secondary objectives should actually be coming out of the primary objective. They should be linked to the primary objective. I'm not sure if I have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
So having answered that in terms of objectives, the same applies also when it comes to hypothesis. With your hypothesis, you have one primary hypothesis. Then from that primary hypothesis, you also formulate secondary hypothesis, which should be coming out of the primary hypothesis. So it's like you are unpacking that primary objective or that primary hypothesis. And in most cases, once you get your objectives right, your hypothesis, you will also get them right. If time allows, in our next sessions, we may try to go through one example so that we can actually be in a position to formulate the primary objectives, to formulate the objectives as well as the hypothesis. I'm sure if we go through that as an example in one of our sessions, it will also make it easier for most of you in your assessments. Anyone else with a question? This is an opportunity to say something during this period of online learning. Okay, I'm trying to remember where exactly I was in terms of the steps. Okay, it was whereby you ought to prepare and process the primary data. So after your primary data has been collected, you ought to edit it to eliminate mistakes. You code it. Prof. Elliott explained the process of coding, that you don't enter data in Excel. When you enter your data in Excel format so that it can be analyzed by statistical softwares, you don't enter it as it may be on the questionnaire. You ought to allocate some codes that you know, and that can also be read by statistical softwares that will be used to analyze research. You can also tabulate it to facilitate the data processing and analysis. So for large surveys, you may actually use data analysis software. I think the most common ones are SPSS, Starter. I think those two are the ones that I can mention for now to analyze quantitative research. You must also take into account the relationship between data collection, preparation, and processing. So if your objectives indicate that this is qualitative research, you cannot use quantitative research analysis techniques. You should use qualitative research analysis techniques. There are also softwares that can be used to analyze qualitative data. I know of Atlas. there are also others that I may not have used as yet. In terms of data analysis for quantitative research, you should also know the statistical tests that can be used to analyze data. So in as much as we have descriptive statistics that you guys know of, the mean, standard deviation, variation, and so forth, you should also know that those can actually be used to analyze data. And when do we use mean? What do we use it for? When do we use mode? What do we use it for? That is basic information which you guys obtained from your statistics. That should have been stats 111. So that information will be necessary in this module. If you have forgotten, you can still read about it in the chapter where it is covered. Prof. Elliot, in the presentations that he pre-recorded for you, he also made that information available for you as to when do you use descriptive statistics, what do you use, which test, what do you use each test for which purpose. There is also inferential statistics, which we normally use for testing the hypothesis. So you should know the different types of inferential statistics, inferential statistical tests. I think there's the commonly used correlation, chi-square, and regression, of which the principles of regression you covered you should have covered in statistics also, stats 111. However, if you missed that information, that information has been made available for you in a pre-recorded session, which is available also on Blackboard. Okay, then the process that I was explaining now was analyzing the primary data. After that, after analyzing the primary data, you interpret the results and you compile a research report. You analyze the results and you compile the research report. In the research report, that's where in the research report, basically you explain from the problem, you highlight the objectives, the design that was used, the secondary data, what you obtained from secondary data, how you collected the primary data, how you analyzed the primary data, then also your findings and your conclusions. You also provide your recommendations in that particular report. That will be the end of the marketing research process. So this is a simple 11-step process that you guys ought to follow. And this, from this chapter, that's where there is now a build up to all other sections or other chapters that you guys ought to cover and listen in the pre-recorded sessions. So I now know that in my next session, the main task that I should do with you is to discuss on how is to go through an example on how to formulate objectives and how to formulate hypotheses. Are there people with questions? Are there people with questions? Are there people with something to say? Okay, Walter, I see your hand is up. You can go ahead.
Okay, so I would like to ask you on the primary data methods of collection, the primary data. We have got the quantitative data and the qualitative data, and on these two, we have got different methods of data collection. Like when we are dealing with the quantitative data, we've got the surveys. Is it possible for that method of survey to collect the data that are qualitative? Is it possible, or the specific methods for qualitative data on its own, and the specific methods of collecting data for quantitative data on its own?
Okay, I will break your question into two. One being whether it is possible to use survey method for the collection of both primary data and secondary data. Then the other part is whether what are other methods of collecting primary data and what are the methods of collecting what are methods of collecting qualitative data and what are the methods of collecting quantitative data. So survey method, yes, you can use it for both. Why I'm saying so, you can use qualitative I'm sure with survey you are not you don't have a problem using it for quantitative. So I can explain more on how you can use it to collect qualitative data. So if you design your questionnaire in a way that it will give you if you design your questionnaire in a way that it has open-ended questions, the data that you collect from that questionnaire, even after using a survey to distribute the questionnaire to ensure that it reaches a wider community, once you use open-ended questions where the respondents can freely express themselves, that data automatically becomes qualitative data. So that way you can actually use survey to collect qualitative data. And if your questionnaire is open-ended questions, that data becomes qualitative, not quantitative. So survey method, yes, it can be used to collect qualitative data. But other methods that can also be used to collect qualitative data besides surveys, you can also use focus groups, whereby you can actually group people into smaller groups. Then you find a facilitator who then facilitate the discussion. You can use focus groups to collect qualitative data. Then to collect quantitative data, I'm sure on that one you are pretty much clear that you can use survey method. The methods that can be used to collect data under survey method, you can actually do a you can use a self distribution questionnaire, whereby you as a researcher, you can move from one person to another collecting the data, distributing the questionnaires. Even if you use field workers, they can move around also distributing questionnaires. You can distribute the questionnaires online. So if your respondents has access to internet, you can distribute them online. I'm not sure if that is clear, if I have answered your question or your questions.
Thank you, sir. It's clear.
Oh, okay. Others, do you have questions? Okay, if there are no questions, thank you for attending. We are meeting again on Tuesday, but now you don't have to wait for me to lead you in any chapter, because all the material is available to you. My role when I come for live interactions is basically to answer questions that you guys have. So I think I have done what I'm supposed to do. All the chapters that is coming after chapter 3 are basically built up. So I will only address problem areas now. So it is important for you to engage with the learning material that was made available for you. I will see you next week when we will go through an example. And if there are people with questions, I will be answering questions. Yandiswa, you can go ahead. Yeah, Yandiswa, you can unmute and ask
Okay,
your
sir,
question.
I've been meaning to ask. Yes, I've already unmuted, sir. Yes. Sir, on the learning guide, it says that on the 7th, we are writing test 1. Are we still writing it?
Test 1 on the 7th of September.
Yes, it was written on the learning guide.
Yes, everything that is on the learning guide is correct.
Okay, so we are still writing at 8.
Is it at 8?
Yes.
I will have to look at that because in the learning guide, is it saying you guys are writing at 8, or what is it actually saying? Because I'm looking at the schedule where you have important information. It's basically giving you a date for test 1.
Oh, sorry, sir, not at 8. I made a mistake, man.
You are supposed to have submitted it. Yeah, it's actually at 8.
Okay.
That's when it will be available.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
That's when it will be available. But I think you will be able to write it even afternoon. So I think now what it means is I should actually do a recording for formulating the objectives and the hypothesis, because I cannot do it on that day when you will be writing. I should allow you to write freely there. So I should cover that before you guys write. Otherwise, if I do not cover it, an alternative will be to post a question paper where students were asked to formulate a research question, to formulate a research problem, research objectives, and also provide the memo so that you can see what is expected of you. I think that will be the only alternative, whereby I actually provide you the question paper with questions where students are expected to formulate objectives, and also the memo, so that you can also see how those objectives ought to be formulated and what is expected. If the memo is not clear, I will try to make it a bit clear for you before you write on the 7th. And thank you for reminding me. All the best for your test on the 7th. So those that didn't want to interact or to engage the learning material, now you have a reason. If you were waiting for a test and for an assignment is not usually enough. If you were waiting for a test, now there is a test next week. All the best. Thank you. Anyone else with something to say? Concerning what is in the learning guide, I will not be reminding people of when the test date is, when the test is. That's not my duty. That's why I gave you the learning guide, so that you will know. So if you don't read it, it's up to you. It's your responsibility to read it and to take note of the important dates. Anyone else with a question? Okay, guys, if there's no further questions, thank you. See you next week when you will be writing your tests. I will be available to assist those that will have challenges, not challenges of not knowing answers, but challenges in terms of submission and other technical issues. Thank you so much. See you next week.